Blood froze in James Blackwood's veins as he discovered the small, lifeless form half buried in the snow, a native child with blue lips and skin like ice, whose survival would shatter the walls he'd built around his heart for 12 bitter years. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The December wind howled across the Montana plains with a fury that seemed personal, as if nature itself held a grudge against those who dared to claim this land as their own. Snow fell in thick, angry sheets, transforming the landscape into a blinding white void that erased boundaries between earth and sky. Through this merciless tempest rode James Blackwood, his broad shoulders hunched against the assault of winter, his weathered face partially protected by the wide brim of his hat and the wool scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. At 58, James had spent more than half his life building Blackwood Ranch into one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. 5,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, 300 head of prize Hereford cattle, a sprawling main house constructed of sturdy pine logs harvested from the mountains to the west, and a reputation that commanded respect from Billings to Helena. But for all his wealth and standing, James rode alone that December afternoon, as he had been alone for the past 12 years. The memory of Elizabeth still haunted him, her golden hair spread across the pillow as fever claimed her, their son Thomas holding her hand until his own small fingers went limp with the same illness just 3 days later. Pneumonia, the doctor had called it, as if giving the darkness a name somehow made its cruelty more bearable. In a single week, James had buried his wife of 15 years and their 10-year-old son, leaving only their teenage daughter Catherine to keep him tethered to whatever remained of his heart. But Catherine, too, had left, not through death's door, but on the eastbound train to Boston 6 years ago, fleeing the suffocating grief that permeated the ranch like smoke from a perpetual fire. Her letters came regularly, filled with news of university life and later her marriage to a professor of literature. James kept them in a cedar box beside his bed, reading them by lamplight on nights when the silence of his empire grew too profound to bear. "Steady, Bishop," James murmured to his horse, a sturdy black gelding who snorted in protest as another gust of wind drove the snow horizontally into their path. "One just need to check the north fence line, then we'll head back." The north boundary of Blackwood Ranch bordered land that had once belonged to the Crow people before treaties and government mandates had pushed them onto reservations farther east. James had always maintained a respectful distance, understanding all too well what it meant to lose something precious. Though he rarely encountered any native people these days, he'd instructed his ranch hands never to disturb any who might pass through his property during seasonal migrations or hunting. As Bishop carried him along the fence line, James squinted through the veil of white, checking for any breaks that might allow his cattle to wander. The temperature had dropped sharply since noon, and even through his heavy sheepskin coat, he could feel the bite of cold reaching for his bones. Another hour, perhaps less, and he would need to turn back or risk freezing before reaching the warmth of his home. It was then, as he rounded a bend where the fence dipped into a shallow ravine, that he saw something. A dark smudge against the pristine snow, incongruous and still. At first, James thought it might be a fallen deer or perhaps one of his calves that had somehow strayed, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that stopped his heart for a moment. A child, a small human form half buried in a drift, unmoving. "Dear God," he breathed, dismounting so quickly that Bishop startled. James stumbled through the knee-deep snow, his legs leaden with cold and fear. Reaching the figure, he brushed away the snow with frantic hands. It was a girl, perhaps 12 years old, her copper skin now alarmingly pale, her black hair frozen in tendrils around a delicate face. She wore clothing that offered little protection against the Montana winter, a dress of animal hide adorned with beadwork, leggings, and moccasins, all dusted with snow. Around her neck hung a small pouch decorated with porcupine quills, and clutched in her small hand was what appeared to be a carved wooden figure. James pressed his fingers to her neck, releasing a ragged breath when he felt the faint flutter of a pulse. She lived, but barely. Hypothermia had already begun its deadly work. Without immediate shelter and warmth, the child would not survive another hour. Without hesitation, James shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around the girl's small frame. He lifted her, surprised at how little she weighed, and carried her to Bishop. The horse shifted nervously, sensing the urgency in his master's movements. "Easy, boy," James soothed, managing to mount while cradling the child against his chest. "We've got precious cargo now." Turning Bishop toward home, James urged the horse to as fast a pace as was safe in the treacherous conditions. The wind seemed to cut straight through his wool shirt now that he'd surrendered his coat, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind raced with practical concerns: how to warm the girl safely, what supplies he might need, whether Mrs. Abernathy, his housekeeper, would know what to do for a child suffering from exposure. As they rode, James looked down at the small face pressed against his chest. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she ended up alone in a blizzard, miles from any settlement or reservation? The questions tumbled through his mind, but finding answers would have to wait. First, he had to save her life. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just hold on." In that moment, something shifted in James Blackwood's world, a world that had grown narrow and cold over years of isolation. For the first time in more than a decade, someone needed him, truly needed him. And despite the howling storm and the mortal danger, despite not knowing who this child was, or what bringing her into his home might mean, James felt something stir within his chest. It wasn't quite hope. He had lived too long without that particular luxury to recognize it immediately, but it was something close, something that quickened his pulse and straightened his spine as Bishop carried them homeward through the relentless Montana blizzard. The Blackwood ranch house emerged from the swirling snow like a vision, golden light spilling from its windows, smoke rising steadily from the stone chimney. James had never been so grateful for the sight of home. Bishop, sensing their destination, quickened his pace despite his exhaustion, hooves crunching through the fresh powder that had accumulated in the yard. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Abernathy, his housekeeper of 15 years, called from the porch as she spotted his approach. Her expression of relief quickly transformed to alarm when she saw the bundle clutched against his chest. "Good heavens, what have you found?" "A child," James answered, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Crow, I think. Nearly frozen. Help me get her inside." Mrs. Abernathy, Beatrice to the few who had earned the privilege of using her Christian name, was a practical woman not given to hesitation. Widowed young during the Civil War, she had made her way west with nothing but determination and skill as a cook. James had hired her shortly after Elizabeth's death, and she had managed his household with quiet efficiency ever since, keeping the ghosts at bay with routine and occasional sharp words when his melancholy threatened to swallow him whole. Now, she rushed forward as James dismounted awkwardly, still cradling the unconscious girl. "Robert," she called over her shoulder, "come take Mr. Blackwood's horse. And bring in more firewood, all you can carry. Robert Mason, the 16-year-old son of James's foreman, emerged from the barn and hurried to take Bishop's reins, his eyes widening at the sight of the child in his employer's arms. "Yes, ma'am," he responded, leading the exhausted horse toward the warmth of the stable. Inside, the ranch house was blessedly warm. A fire roared in the great stone hearth that dominated the main room, and oil lamps cast a golden glow over the polished wooden floors and sturdy furniture. James carried the girl directly to the sofa nearest the fire, his muscles aching from the strain of holding her during the long ride. "Not there," Mrs. Abernathy directed sharply. "We need to warm her gradually. Too much heat too quickly could kill her." She pointed instead to a spot farther from the flames. "Lay her there while I fetch blankets and hot water bottles." James obeyed, carefully placing the small form on the indicated spot. As he unwrapped his coat from around her, he noted again how fragile she seemed, how utterly vulnerable. Her breathing was shallow, her skin frighteningly cold to the touch. Her dark lashes lay motionless against cheeks that should have been round with childhood, but instead appeared hollowed by what must have been days of exposure and hunger. "Who is she?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, as she returned with an armload of blankets and began expertly arranging them around the child. "I don't know," James admitted, stepping back to allow his housekeeper room to work. "Found her half buried in snow up by the north fence line. No sign of anyone else nearby. She was just there, alone in the storm." Mrs. Abernathy made a sound of distress in her throat as she gently removed the girl's frozen moccasins and began to rub her feet with a soft cloth. "Poor little thing. Must have gotten separated from her people somehow." She glanced up at James. "You should change into dry clothes before you catch your death as well." "I'll tend to her." James nodded, reluctant to leave but aware that his housekeeper was right. As he turned toward the staircase that led to his bedroom, Mrs. Abernathy's voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwood," her tone had softened. "You did a good thing today." He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and continued upstairs. By the time he returned, dressed in dry clothing and carrying a medical kit that had rarely seen use since Elizabeth and Thomas had fallen ill, Mrs. Abernathy had the girl wrapped in warm blankets. She had removed the wet outer garments and dressed her in one of Catherine's old nightgowns, preserved all these years in a cedar chest upstairs. The white cotton looked strange against the girl's copper skin, like snow on autumn earth. "Will she live?" James asked quietly, setting the medical kit on a nearby table. Mrs. Abernathy's hands, never idle, continued their work of gently warming the child's limbs through the blankets. "If she makes it through the night, she has a chance. She's young and appears strong, despite everything, but she's been out in that cold for a long while, Mr. Blackwood. It's in God's hands now." As if in response to their conversation, the girl stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. Both adults went still, watching intently. For a moment, her eyes opened, dark, deep pools that seemed to hold all the wisdom and sorrow of her people, and fixed on James's face. There was no fear in that gaze, only a profound exhaustion and something that might have been recognition, though he knew they had never met. Her lips moved, forming a word without sound, before her eyes closed again and she slipped back into unconsciousness. "What did she say?" Mrs. Abernathy whispered. James shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I couldn't make it out." As the evening deepened into night, the storm continued its assault outside, but inside the Blackwood home, a different kind of change was brewing. James sat in his chair near the girl, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets, listening to the occasional murmurs that escaped her lips in a language he didn't understand. For the first time in years, the ghosts of his past seemed to keep their distance, as if respecting the fragile new presence that had entered their domain. Dawn broke over the Montana landscape, revealing a world transformed by the blizzard. Snow lay in deep drifts against the buildings of Blackwood Ranch. Trees bent under the weight of ice, and the vast plains stretched unbroken white to the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline stillness that seemed to hold the world in suspension. Inside the ranch house, James awakened with a start, momentarily disoriented to find himself in his chair rather than his bed. The events of the previous day rushed back as his gaze fell on the small figure still wrapped in blankets near the fire, which Mrs. Abernathy had maintained throughout the night. The housekeeper herself was dozing in a nearby rocking chair, her usually perfect posture softened by exhaustion. James rose quietly, his joints protesting after hours in the chair. He moved to check on the girl, careful not to disturb either her or Mrs. Abernathy. To his surprise and relief, her color had improved dramatically, the deathly pallor replaced by a healthy warmth. Her breathing, too, seemed stronger, more regular. As he stood watching, her eyelids fluttered open. This time, her gaze was clear and alert as it settled on him. She didn't speak, but her dark eyes followed his every movement with the wary attention of a young animal encountering a new and potentially dangerous creature. James recognized that look. It was the same careful assessment he'd seen in the eyes of countless wild things he'd encountered on his land over the years. "Hello," he said softly, crouching down to her level but maintaining a respectful distance. "You're safe here." The girl's expression didn't change, but something in her posture eased slightly. She glanced around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings before returning her attention to James. With deliberate movements, she pushed herself up to a sitting position, wincing slightly as blood flowed back into limbs that had been still for too long. Mrs. Abernathy stirred at the movement, her eyes opening instantly. Unlike James, who had spent the night drifting in and out of sleep, the housekeeper seemed to awaken fully alert, immediately assessing the situation. "Well now," she said, her voice gentler than James had heard it in years. "Or look who's rejoined the land of the living." The girl turned toward the new voice, her gaze just as intent, but now tinged with curiosity. Mrs. Abernathy smiled and mimed drinking from a cup. "Would you like some broth, child? Something warm to drink?" After a moment's consideration, the girl nodded slowly. "I'll fetch it," James offered, rising to his feet. "It's already prepared in the kitchen." While he was gone, Mrs. Abernathy approached the girl with unhurried movements, adjusting the blankets around her shoulders. "My name is Mrs. Abernathy," she said clearly, placing a hand on her chest. "And that man who just left is Mr. Blackwood. He found you in the snow." The girl watched her lips intently, as if trying to decipher the sounds. After a moment, she touched her own chest and said softly, "Sarah." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Sarah? Is that your name?" The girl, Sarah, nodded. "Sarah Littlefeather." When James returned with a mug of warm chicken broth, he found Mrs. Abernathy sitting beside the girl, their heads close together. "She speaks some English," the housekeeper informed him with evident satisfaction. "Says her name is Sarah Littlefeather." James felt an unexpected surge of emotion at this simple information. A name gave her substance, made her real in a way that the girl had not. He handed the mug to Mrs. Abernathy, who helped Sarah wrap her slender fingers around it, supporting it when they trembled with weakness. Sarah, James repeated, tasting the name. It was unexpected, a Christian name rather than a traditional Crow one. Where is your family, Sarah? Your people? Sarah took a careful sip of the broth before answering. Her voice was soft but clear, her English halting but understandable. Moving camp, winter grounds. She gestured vaguely eastward. Storm came fast. I was gathering. She frowned, searching for a word, then made a motion of picking something small from the ground. Berries, herbs, Mrs. Abernathy suggested. Sarah nodded at the second word. Herbs, medicine. For my grandmother. She teaches me. Pride flickered across her young face. I am learning to be medicine woman. And you got separated from your people in the storm, James concluded, the pieces falling into place. Sarah nodded, her expression sobering. Wind too strong, snow too thick, could not find way back. She clutched the small pouch at her neck, walked and walked until no more strength. James and Mrs. Abernathy exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. It was a miracle the child had survived at all. Many grown men, experienced frontiersmen, had perished in Montana, blizzards far less severe than the one that had just passed. How far is your winter camp? James asked. Sarah considered this, her brow furrowing in concentration. 2 sleeps, maybe 3 now. Near the big river bend. James nodded, knowing the location she described. It was indeed a 2-day ride under good conditions, and conditions were far from good at present, with snow drifted high enough in places to reach a horse's chest. When you're stronger, he promised, I'll take you home to your people. But for now, you need to rest and recover. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something in his expression. Whatever she sought, she seemed to find it, for she nodded once and relaxed back against the pillows Mrs. Abernathy had arranged. Thank you, she said simply, for finding me in the snow. It was a child's gratitude, uncomplicated and direct. But it struck James with unexpected force. When had anyone last thanked him for anything more significant than passing the salt at dinner? Not since Catherine left, certainly. He had become an island in human form, self-sufficient and isolated by choice as much as by circumstance. Yet here was this child, this survivor, looking at him not with the careful deference his ranch hands showed, nor the cautious respect of business associates, but with simple human gratitude. You're welcome, Sarah Littlefeather, he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Indeed, you're welcome here. The days that followed passed in a gentle rhythm as Sarah regained her strength. The snow lay too deep for safe travel, effectively isolating Blackwood Ranch from both town and the distant native encampment. James sent Robert Mason on horseback to inform his father and the other ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse of their unexpected guest. But otherwise, the main house remained a quiet sanctuary for healing. Sarah proved to be a remarkably resilient child. By the 3rd day, she was sitting up for hours at a time, her keen eyes taking in everything around her. By the 5th, she was walking slowly through the house, trailing her fingers along unfamiliar objects, the spines of books on shelves, the polished wood of the banister, the cold glass of windows that kept the winter at bay while allowing its beauty to enter. To Mrs. Abernathy's surprise and evident approval, Sarah was meticulously neat and eager to help with small tasks as her strength returned. She folded blankets with careful precision, arranged kindling by the fireplace, and watched intently as the housekeeper prepared meals, absorbing each new technique as if it was sacred knowledge. The child has been raised right, Mrs. Abernathy remarked to James one evening as they sat in his study, the ledges of the ranch spread before them. not a lazy bone in her body, and respectful too. Her people must be sick with worry. James nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where snow still fell, though more gently now. As soon as the trails are passable, I'll take her home. He paused, adding softly, though I find myself in no particular hurry. Mrs. Abernathy gave him a knowing look, but said nothing. She had observed the change in her employer, subtle but unmistakable. He smiled more often. His shoulders seemed less burdened. He had even taken to reading aloud in the evenings, sharing stories from the books that had gathered dust on his shelves for years. Most remarkable of all, he had opened the piano that had stood silent since Elizabeth's death, running his fingers over the yellowed keys one evening when he thought no one was watching. He hadn't played, not yet, but the very fact that he'd removed the cover felt like a thawing of something long frozen. On the 7th day after Sarah's arrival, James found her sitting cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, the contents of her medicine pouch spread carefully on a clean cloth before her. There were small bundles of dried plants, a few stones polished by water, what appeared to be the tooth of some animal, and the wooden carving he had noticed clutched in her hand when he found her, a small, intricately detailed bird with spread wings. "You, what are you doing?" he asked, lowering himself to sit nearby, mindful not to disturb her arrangement. Sarah looked up, her dark eyes serious. "Remembering," she replied. "Grandmother says, medicine woman must remember all plants, all stones, all animals that heal." She touched each item reverently. "This for fever," she said, indicating a bundle of dried leaves. "This for pain," she continued, pointing to another. "This for courage," she added, picking up the animal tooth. James leaned closer, genuinely interested. "And what of the bird? What does it heal?" Sarah picked up the carving, holding it so the firelight played across its surface, revealing the careful detail work. "Not for healing body," she explained, "for healing spirit." She handed it to him with solemn ceremony. "My father made for me. Hawk sees far, sees truth beyond mountains." James accepted the carving with appropriate gravity, turning it in his hands to admire the craftsmanship. Whoever had made it possessed considerable skill and an artist's eye for detail. "It's beautiful," he said honestly. "Your father is very talented." A shadow passed across Sarah's face. "Was," she corrected softly. "He walks with ancestors now." 2 winters passed. "I'm sorry," James said, the words inadequate but sincere. Loss was a language he understood all too well. Sarah nodded, accepting his sympathy. Then, with the directness of youth, she asked, "You have lost people too?" The question caught him off guard. In Montana Territory, personal history was something most men carried silently, shared only in fragments, if at all. But looking into Sarah's earnest face, James found himself unwilling to dismiss her with the polite evasions he might have used with others. "Yes," he answered simply. "My wife, Elizabeth, and my son, Thomas. Many years ago now." Sarah absorbed this information with a nod, as if confirming something she had already sensed. "That is why your house feels—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Empty." Even with many things inside. The observation, delivered without judgment or pity, struck James with the force of revelation. Yes, that was exactly it. His house was full of objects, comforts, the trappings of wealth, but empty of what mattered most. He had built a fortress against further loss, only to find himself a prisoner within its walls. "My daughter, Catherine, still lives," he offered, the words emerging of their own accord. "But she's far away in Boston. Needed to leave this place after her mother and brother died. Sarah considered this, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. Sometimes spirit needs new ground to grow again, she said, like plants after fire. The simple wisdom of her words resonated deeply with James. He had never thought of Catherine's departure in those terms, had seen it only as abandonment, another loss to bear. But perhaps Sarah was right. Perhaps his daughter had needed to seek fertile ground elsewhere to survive. "Do you write to her?" Sarah asked, carefully returning her medicine items to their pouch. "She writes to me," James corrected. "I don't write back as often as I should." Sarah's expression turned gently chiding. "Words are medicine too," she said. "They can heal distance." James felt a flush of shame at being so gently schooled by a child, yet there was no condescension in her manner, only the straightforward sharing of a truth she held to be self-evident. "Perhaps you're right," he conceded. Sarah smiled then, the first full smile he had seen from her, a transformation that lit her entire face and revealed the child beneath the old soul. "I'm right," she stated with such innocent certainty that James found himself chuckling, a rusty sound that surprised them both. As they sat together in the warm firelight, an unlikely pair connected by chance and circumstance, James realized that the emptiness of his house had already begun to change, filled by the presence of a small, wise spirit who saw truth beyond mountains. 2 weeks after Sarah's arrival, the weather finally relented. The brilliant Montana sun emerged from behind the clouds, setting the snow-covered landscape aglitter like a sea of diamonds. The temperature rose just enough to begin the slow process of melting, and by mid-afternoon, James could hear the steady drip of water from the eaves as he stood on the porch, assessing conditions. The trail to the Crow winter encampment would still be challenging, but no longer impossible. Another day or two of this weather, and they could make the journey safely. The realization brought with it a curious hollowness in his chest that James refused to examine too closely. "Mr. Mason says the South Pass is clearing," Robert reported, approaching from the direction of the bunkhouse. The boy had appointed himself unofficial courier between the main house and the ranch hands during Sarah's stay, clearly enjoying his expanded responsibilities. "Pa thinks by tomorrow afternoon, the worst drifts will be passable." James nodded, unsurprised by the assessment. Frank Mason had an uncanny ability to predict both weather and trail conditions, a skill that had made him invaluable as foreman of Blackwood Ranch. "Thank you, Robert. Please tell your father I'd like to speak with him about preparing for the journey to return Sarah to her people." Robert nodded, hesitated, then blurted, "Will she be leaving soon then?" James studied the boy's face, noting the poorly concealed disappointment. Robert wasn't the only one who had grown attached to their unexpected guest. Even the most taciturn of the ranch hands had taken to leaving small gifts outside the main house: a whittled wooden horse, a particularly unusual rock, a hawk feather found near the creek. "Yes," James answered simply. "It's time she went home." As Robert trudged back toward the bunkhouse, shoulders slightly slumped, James turned to find Sarah standing in the doorway behind him. Her dark eyes, always observant, had caught the entire exchange. "The snow melts," she stated. "Soon we go." "Yes," James confirmed. "Your people must be very worried about you." Sarah nodded, her expression solemn. "Grandmother will have made medicine for my safe return. She has strong dreams." She stepped out onto the porch to stand beside him, her small hand coming to rest on the railing. The top of her head barely reached his elbow, yet there was something so composed, so centered about her presence that she never seemed small. "I will miss this place," she said after a moment of companionable silence. And the people. James felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. We'll miss you too, Sarah Littlefeather. She looked up at him then, her gaze direct and piercing. You could visit. The journey is not so far. The suggestion startled him. In all his years in Montana Territory, despite owning land that bordered native territories, James had never considered visiting a tribal encampment. Relations between settlers and the indigenous peoples had been relatively peaceful in recent years, but they remained separate worlds, coexisting but rarely intersecting. I suppose I could, he agreed cautiously. Sarah smiled, apparently satisfied with this tentative response. Good. Grandmother will want to thank you, and I can show you the healing plants. Inside the house, preparations for the journey had already begun. Mrs. Abernathy, with her usual efficiency, was packing provisions, jerky, biscuits, dried fruit and coffee, all carefully wrapped and stowed in saddlebags. She had also taken it upon herself to mend Sarah's original clothing, which now lay neatly folded on a chair, the beadwork cleaned and the tears repaired with nearly invisible stitches. I've included extra blankets, she informed James as he entered the kitchen. The nights are still bitter cold and the child is only just recovered. James nodded, noting the unusual edge in his housekeeper's voice. Mrs. Abernathy had maintained her professional demeanor throughout Sarah's stay, but he hadn't missed the softening in her expression when she thought no one was looking, or the way she sometimes hummed as she worked, something she hadn't done in all the years he'd known her. You've grown fond of her, he observed quietly. Mrs. Abernathy's hands stilled momentarily over the provisions. She's a remarkable child, she admitted. Wise beyond her years, but still very much a child. She looked up at him, her usually guarded expression open for once. I had a daughter once, you know. Before the war, she would have been about Sarah's age when... She trailed off, shaking her head as if to dispel the memory. Well, that was another life. James stared at her, momentarily speechless. In 15 years, Mrs. Abernathy had never spoken of a child. He had known she was a widow, of course, but had assumed she had been childless. I'm sorry, he said finally. I didn't know. No reason you should have, she replied briskly, returning to her packing. It was a long time ago. After a moment, she added more softly, but having Sarah here... It's been a reminder of certain joys I'd forgotten. That evening, as snow continued to melt under the setting sun, James retreated to his study to review maps of the territory, plotting the most direct route to the Crow winter encampment. The journey would take 2 days, possibly 3 if conditions worsened again. He would take Frank Mason with him. The foreman was familiar with the area and had traded with the Crow in the past. As James traced the route with his finger, he became aware of a presence in the doorway. Looking up, he found Sarah watching him, her expression thoughtful. "What is it?" he asked. "You are troubled," she said simply. James started to deny it, then stopped himself. This child had an uncanny ability to see through pretense. "Just concerned about the journey," he said instead. "I want to get you home safely." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Home is where spirit finds peace," she said. "My people say that land and lodges are just places. Home is where hearts connect." She placed a hand over her chest to illustrate. As James considered her words, he realized that Blackwood Ranch, for all its size and prosperity, had ceased to be a home in that sense long ago. It had become merely a place, a beautiful, well-maintained place, but one devoid of the connections that made a true home. Until Sarah had arrived, bringing with her a wisdom that cut through the walls he had built around his heart. Dawn broke clear and cold on the day of departure. The sky stretched endless blue above Blackwood Ranch, and the sun cast long shadows across the trampled snow of the yard where horses stamped impatiently, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. James checked the cinch on Bishop's saddle one final time, then turned to survey the preparations. Frank Mason, tall and weathered from decades of Montana seasons, was securing the last of the provisions to a sturdy pack horse. The foreman's face was impassive, as always, but James knew him well enough to recognize the subtle signs of anticipation. Frank had a deep respect for the indigenous peoples of the territory and had served as unofficial liaison between the ranch and neighboring tribes for years. "Trail looks good as far as Eagle Ridge," Frank reported, tightening a strap with practiced efficiency. "Beyond that, we'll need to stick to high ground. The creek's starting to thaw, and the lower path will be mud by midday," James nodded, trusting the foreman's assessment. "We'll follow your lead." The door of the main house opened, and Mrs. Abernathy emerged with Sarah. The housekeeper had outdone herself. The girl wore her original clothing, now expertly mended, but with the addition of a warm woolen cloak that Mrs. Abernathy had apparently modified from one of Catherine's old garments. It was practical for travel, but fine enough to convey respect for the child and her people. Sarah herself seemed to have undergone a transformation overnight. Though still a young girl, she carried herself with a new dignity, as if the prospect of returning to her people had awakened something essential within her. Her hair had been neatly braided, and around her neck, her medicine pouch hung alongside a small leather bundle that James recognized as a parting gift from Mrs. Abernathy, seeds from the kitchen garden, carefully selected and packaged for spring planting. "I've packed extra coffee," Mrs. Abernathy announced, her tone brisk to cover the emotion James could see in her eyes. "And there's a jar of honey for her grandmother." "Medicinal properties," she added, as if needing to justify the luxury. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy," James said softly. The housekeeper nodded, then turned to Sarah, adjusting the cloak around her shoulders one last time. "Now you remember what I showed you about the stitching and the herb garden?" "I remember," Sarah assured her. "Grandmother will be pleased to learn new medicines." Mrs. Abernathy pressed her lips together, then did something James had never witnessed in 15 years. She leaned down and embraced Sarah, holding the girl tightly for a moment before straightening and stepping back. Her composure recovered. "Safe travels," she said, nodding to both James and Frank before turning and marching back to the house, her spine rigid. James exchanged a glance with Frank, who tactfully busied himself with a final check of the horses. Then he approached Sarah, who stood watching him with those calm, knowing eyes. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and he lifted her easily onto the smaller horse they had prepared for her, a gentle mare named Willow that had carried Catherine when she was young. For a moment, the image of his daughter superimposed itself over Sarah, bringing a sharp pang of nostalgia and regret. They set off as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, casting golden light across the snow-covered landscape. Frank led the way, followed by Sarah on Willow, with James and the packhorse bringing up the rear. As they crested the first hill, James turned in the saddle for one last look at Blackwood Ranch spread below. The main house with smoke curling from its chimney, the bunkhouse, the barn and corrals, the distant pastures where his cattle were winter-fed on hay harvested the previous summer. It was an impressive sight, the physical manifestation of 20 years of hard work and shrewd business decisions. Yet looking at it now, James felt strangely detached, as if viewing a painting of someone else's life. The emptiness Sarah had observed seemed more apparent from this distance, a hollow at the heart of all that prosperity. As if sensing his thoughts, Sarah glanced back at him. "Your land is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed, turning away from the view to face forward again. The morning passed in companionable silence as they followed game trails and ridge lines eastward. Frank, ever vigilant, scouted ahead at tricky passages, testing the snow depth and checking for ice beneath the surface that might endanger the horses. The temperature rose gradually as the sun climbed, turning the snow surface slick and reflective. By midday, they had covered nearly 10 miles, good progress given the conditions. They stopped in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and hot coffee brewed over a small fire. Sarah sat cross-legged on a fallen log, watching as Frank pointed out landmarks on the distant horizon. "See that notch in the ridge? That's Crow Pass. Another day's ride beyond that is where we'll likely find your people's winter camp." Sarah nodded, her expression brightening at the mention of her destination. "And grandmother will have seen us coming in her dreams," she said confidently. "She has the gift of far seeing." Frank nodded, accepting this without skepticism. "Many of the elders have such gifts," he agreed. "My mother told me of a Blackfoot medicine man who could find lost children by dreaming their location." James, listening to this exchange, was struck by the easy way Frank spoke of such things, not as superstitions to be humored, but as realities to be respected. It was a perspective James had never fully considered, having been raised with more conventional Christian beliefs. Yet after his time with Sarah, he found himself less quick to dismiss such ideas. As they continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape began to change subtly. The rolling grasslands of Blackwood Ranch gave way to more varied terrain. Stands of pine and aspen, rocky outcroppings, and the occasional steep ravine. This was less familiar territory to James, though he had hunted here in years past. "We'll make camp at Broken Bow Creek," Frank announced as the shadows lengthened. "There's good shelter and water for the horses." James nodded, noticing that Sarah had grown quiet over the past hour, her small shoulders tense beneath the woolen cloak. When they paused to let the horses drink from a partially frozen stream, he maneuvered Bishop alongside Willow. "Are you tired?" he asked gently. "We can stop earlier if needed." Sarah shook her head, but her usual composure seemed diminished. "Not tired," she said softly. "Just thinking about your family." "Yes." She hesitated, then added, "and about leaving you." The night at Broken Bow Creek passed peacefully beneath a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. James found himself sleeping more soundly than he had in years, despite the hard ground beneath his bedroll and the occasional distant howl of wolves. There was something fundamentally right about being out in the open country again, something he had forgotten during the years of allowing ledgers and business concerns to define his days. They broke camp at first light, Frank efficiently dousing the fire while James saddled the horses. Sarah helped without being asked, rolling her bedding and gathering kindling to replace what they had used, leaving the site as they had found it. "We'll reach the high ridge by midday," Frank explained as they mounted. "From there, we can see clear to Thunder Basin. The Crow camp will likely be just beyond, in the sheltered valley near the river." Sarah nodded, her face composed but her eyes bright with anticipation. The prospect of reunion seemed to energize her, and she sat straighter in her saddle as they rode through the scattered pines, their branches heavy with melting snow that occasionally dropped in soft plops to the ground below. The morning progressed smoothly until they reached the approach to Eagle Ridge, a steep, narrow trail that switchbacked up the hillside. Here, the earlier thaw had refrozen overnight, creating treacherous conditions. Ice glistened on exposed rocks, and the path itself had been churned into frozen ruts by deer and elk. Frank dismounted to lead his horse, gesturing for the others to do the same. "Watch your footing," he warned. "One slip here could be nasty." They proceeded with caution, James keeping close to Sarah as they navigated the dangerous terrain. The girl showed no fear, her moccasins finding purchase where even the horses sometimes struggled. Frank forged ahead, using his hunting knife to chip away at the worst patches of ice. They were nearly 3/4 of the way up when disaster struck. The pack horse, following behind James, stepped on a section of trail that gave way beneath its weight. The animal whinnied in terror as its hindquarters slid toward the edge. James lunged for the lead rope, but it was too late. The horse lost its footing completely and began to slide down the steep slope, the precious supplies strapped to its back going with it. "No!" Sarah cried, the first real fear he had seen from her flashing across her face. Frank reacted instantly, scrambling down the slope after the panicked animal, using saplings and outcroppings as anchors. James could only watch, heart in his throat, as man and beast disappeared from view around the curve of the hillside. "Stay here with the other horses," he instructed Sarah firmly. "Do not move from this spot." She nodded, gathering the reins of Willow and Bishop in her small hands as James carefully picked his way down the treacherous slope in Frank's wake. He found the foreman about 50 yards down, where the pack horse had finally come to rest against a fallen tree. The animal was breathing hard, eyes rolling in fear, but appeared largely uninjured. The same could not be said for their supplies. The packs had torn open during the fall, scattering their contents down the slope. Coffee grounds mixed with snow, jerky lay strewn among pine needles, and one of the water skins had ruptured, its contents already freezing in the cold air. "Could have been worse," Frank observed grimly, running his hands over the horse's legs to check for injuries. "Animals sound, and we can salvage some of the provisions." It took them nearly an hour to collect what could be saved, repack it securely, and lead the still nervous horse back up to the trail where Sarah waited patiently. By the time they resumed their journey, the sun had passed its zenith, and Frank's prediction of reaching the high ridge by midday was no longer possible. "We'll have to push on through the afternoon," he advised. "I'm not safe to camp on this side of the ridge. Too exposed." James nodded, noting the darkening clouds gathering to the west. The weather was shifting again, and the last thing they needed was to be caught in a storm on open ground. As they continued the ascent with redoubled caution, James found himself riding beside Sarah. The girl had maintained her composure throughout the delay, but he sensed a new tension in her shoulders. "You're worried," he observed quietly. She glanced at him, her dark eyes serious. "My people will be looking for signs. If I do not return soon, they may think I have joined the ancestors." The simplicity with which she spoke of death, neither fearful nor morbid, just matter of fact, struck James anew. This child had clearly been raised with a different understanding of life's passages than most European children. "We'll get you home," he assured her. "Our Frank knows this country better than anyone, and your grandmother has her dreams. Remember, she'll know you're alive." Sarah considered this, then nodded, seemingly reassured. After a moment, she asked, "Why do you stay alone in your big house?" The question, coming without preamble, caught James off guard. "I'm not alone," he said automatically. "There's Mrs. Abernathy and the ranch hands." Sarah shook her head, cutting him off with a gesture. "Not what I meant. Why no new wife? No more children?" James felt a flush of discomfort at the directness of her inquiry. Such personal matters were rarely discussed so openly in his experience, yet looking at Sarah's earnest face, he found himself unable to dismiss the question with the polite evasion he might have offered anyone else. After Elizabeth died, he said slowly, I couldn't imagine finding that kind of love again. And as for children, I didn't do right by Catherine. Didn't know how to help her through her grief. What right did I have to bring more children into the world when I'd failed the one I had? The words emerged with a rawness that surprised him, truths he had never articulated even to himself, let alone spoken aloud. Sarah listened with complete attention, her gaze never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, considering his words with the seriousness they deserved. My people say grief is like river, she finally replied. Cannot stop it flowing, can only learn to swim or drown. She looked ahead to where Frank was picking their path through a stand of aspen. You tried not to drown, so did your daughter. Different rivers, different ways to swim. James felt his throat tighten at the simple wisdom of her words. And what would your people say about a man who builds walls to keep out both sorrow and joy? Sarah's mouth curved in a small, sad smile. They would say he has forgotten how to live, that his spirit is sleeping. She reached out suddenly, placing her small hand on his arm. But spirits can wake again, James Blackwood. I have seen yours stirring. The use of his given name, the first time she had addressed him so, sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. Before he could respond, Frank called back from ahead, Ridge is just beyond those trees. We'll make it before nightfall after all. As the path widened and grew less treacherous, they were able to quicken their pace. By late afternoon, they crested the ridge and were rewarded with a view that stole the breath from James's lungs. Below them stretched Thunder Basin, a vast natural amphitheater ringed by snow-dusted mountains and bisected by a ribbon of river that flashed silver in the waning light. And there, nestled in a protected curve of the waterway, was the Crow winter encampment, dozens of lodges arranged in a great circle, thin columns of smoke rising straight into the still air. Sarah's entire body seemed to come alive at the sight. She sat forward in her saddle, eyes bright, a smile of pure joy transforming her solemn features. My people, she whispered. Frank pointed to movement near the edge of the camp. But they've spotted us, he said. Look there, riders coming to investigate. Indeed, several mounted figures had detached from the encampment and were now making their way toward the base of the ridge. James felt a curious mixture of relief and regret wash over him. Their journey was nearly complete. Sarah would soon be back with her family where she belonged. So why did the thought fill him with such profound sadness? As if reading his mind, Sarah turned to him, her expression suddenly urgent. Remember your promise, she said, to visit. I remember, James assured her, finding to his surprise that he meant it. This would not be goodbye, not a final one, at least. They began their descent toward the valley floor, toward the approaching riders, toward the conclusion of a journey that had somehow become about much more than returning a lost child to her people. The riders approached with cautious dignity, 5 men mounted on sturdy ponies whose breath clouded in the cold air. They wore buffalo robes against the winter chill, their hair in traditional braids adorned with feathers and beads that caught the fading sunlight. The leader, a man of perhaps 40 winters, with a face marked by both wisdom and wariness, raised his hand in greeting as they drew near. Frank returned the gesture and spoke a few words in the Crow language. A greeting, James assumed, though he couldn't understand the specific meaning. The lead rider responded, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the strangers who approached their camp. Then his gaze fell on Sarah, and everything changed. Amaruk, he exclaimed, using what James recognized as Sarah's Crow name. The man's composed expression broke into one of astonished joy as he spurred his pony forward. "Uncle?" Sarah cried in English, then switched to rapid Crow as she urged Willow toward him. The reunion was swift and emotional, the man reaching down to lift Sarah from her saddle with strong arms, holding her close while the other riders circled around, voices raised in what could only be prayers of thanksgiving. Sarah was speaking quickly, gesturing toward James and Frank, clearly explaining her rescue and the journey. The lead rider, Sarah's uncle, set her gently on his horse and approached James, his dark eyes now warm with gratitude. "I am Matthew 3 Eagles," he said in surprisingly good English. "You have brought back our heart." He extended his hand in the white man's customary greeting, a gesture that bridged their different worlds. James clasped it firmly. "James Blackwood. We found Sarah Amaruk during the great storm. She was near death from cold, but she is strong, a survivor." Matthew nodded solemnly, like her father before her. He gestured toward the encampment below. "Please come. Our people will want to honor you. And her grandmother." His voice caught slightly. "Her grandmother has not slept since the child disappeared. She kept saying Amaruk lived, that she walked with a man tall as a pine tree." His gaze took in James's considerable height with new understanding. They rode together toward the camp, Sarah now mounted behind her uncle, her face alight with happiness. As they approached, people emerged from the lodges, women, children, elders, alerted by runners that something momentous was occurring. When they recognized Sarah, a collective sound rose from the crowd, part cry, part song, that made the hair on James's neck stand up. It was the sound of a community welcoming back one of their own, a sound of pure, unrestrained joy. A tiny, ancient woman pushed through the gathering, moving with surprising speed for one who must have seen at least 80 winters. Her white hair was braided with strips of red cloth, and her face was deeply lined, yet her eyes were bright and alert as they fixed on Sarah. "Grandmother?" Sarah slid from the horse and ran to the old woman, who enfolded her in an embrace that seemed to contain both fierceness and infinite tenderness. For a long moment, they simply held each other, the old woman murmuring words too low for James to hear. Then she straightened, keeping one arm around Sarah's shoulders, and looked directly at James with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You are the one from my dreams," she said in English, nearly as clear as her grandson's. "The one who walks with winter in his heart?" James blinked, unsettled by the precise echo of his own thoughts about himself. Before he could respond, Matthew translated her next words from Crow. "She says you have returned our most precious treasure, and for this you will always be welcome among the people of many lodges." James dismounted, feeling awkward in the face of such emotion. "I only did what anyone would do," he said, knowing even as he spoke that it wasn't true. Many men of his acquaintance would have ridden past a native child in the snow, assuming she was already dead, or worse, not caring if she lived or died. The old woman, Sarah had called her grandmother, though James now understood she was a medicine woman respected by the entire community, regarded him with knowing eyes. "Not all would," she said simply. "You have a good heart, even if it sleeps beneath ice." She turned then, speaking in rapid Crow to the gathered people. Matthew translated for the visitors. "On tonight we will feast to welcome home Amaruk Little Feather and to honor the men who brought her safely to us. Come, you must rest after your journey." What followed was unlike anything James had experienced in his decades in Montana Territory. Though he had traded occasionally with native people and employed Crow scouts during cattle drives, he had never been invited into their community, never witnessed their private lives or customs from within. The winter camp was a marvel of practical design and spiritual significance. The lodges, teepees made from buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles, were arranged in a great circle that Matthew explained represented the sacred hoop of life. Each was positioned according to family lineage and clan affiliation, with the lodge of the principal chief at the western point and that of the medicine people at the eastern entrance. It was to this eastern lodge that Sarah's grandmother led them. Inside, the space was warm and welcoming, with buffalo robes covering the ground and a small fire burning in the central pit, its smoke rising through the opening at the top. The walls were adorned with painted symbols and hung with bundles of dried plants, feathers, and other items James couldn't identify but assumed were significant to the old woman's healing work. "Sit," she instructed, indicating places of honor near the fire. "You are welcome in the lodge of Sea's Far Woman." As they settled themselves, Sarah sat beside her grandmother, their resemblance suddenly striking despite the decades that separated them. The same eyes, the same quiet dignity, the same direct gaze that saw more than most. Frank accepted a pipe offered by Matthew, participating in what was clearly a ceremonial welcome with the ease of long familiarity. James, less certain of the protocols, followed his foreman's lead, accepting the pipe when it was passed to him and drawing the smoke as he had seen the others do. The sweet, earthy tobacco was unlike any he had smoked before, and he found himself relaxing as the ritual continued, the strangeness of his surroundings gradually giving way to a sense of timeless peace. As evening deepened into night, more people arrived, bringing food and gifts. The feast was simple but abundant: roasted venison, some kind of root vegetable seasoned with herbs, and flat bread that reminded James of Mrs. Abernathy's biscuits, but with a nutty flavor he couldn't place. Throughout the meal, Sarah moved between worlds with natural grace, speaking Crow with her people, then turning to translate for James when necessary, her hand occasionally touching his arm to draw his attention to some detail she wanted him to understand. "My uncle says you have strong medicine," she informed him at one point. "And to find me in such a big storm," James shook his head, embarrassed. "It wasn't medicine, just luck or providence, if you believe in such things." Sarah considered this, then said something to her grandmother that made the old woman chuckle. "Grandmother says all those are different names for the same thing. The great mystery works through many channels." Later, as the feasting concluded and the gathering turned to storytelling and song, James found himself seated somewhat apart, watching as Sarah was welcomed back into the embrace of her community. She sat with a group of children near her age, their faces animated as they questioned her about her adventures. Every so often, she would glance his way, as if to reassure herself he was still there, and he would nod slightly in acknowledgement. Matthew 3 Eagles settled beside him, offering a cup of some warm beverage that smelled of mint and honey. "My niece speaks highly of you," he said quietly. "She says you treated her with respect in your home." James accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. "She's an extraordinary child. Wise beyond her years," Matthew smiled faintly. "She has always been so. Even as a baby, she watched the world with old eyes." His expression grew more serious. "When her father, my brother, died, we feared the grief might dim her spirit. But Sea's Far Woman took her under her protection, began teaching her the old ways, the healing knowledge." He glanced across the lodge to where his niece sat with the other children. "And she will be a great medicine woman one day." James followed his gaze, seeing Sarah not as the vulnerable child he had found in the snow, but as the future her people envisioned for her, a healer, a keeper of wisdom, a bridge between worlds. It was a future rich with purpose and belonging, so different from the isolated existence he had built for himself. "You have given us back more than a child," Matthew continued softly. You have returned our hope. Morning came to the Crow encampment in a symphony of sounds and colors, the soft murmur of voices as women stirred cooking fires to life, the laughter of children already at play despite the early hour, the pale gold light spilling over the eastern mountains to paint the lodges in warm hues. James stood outside Ceasefire Woman's teepee, a cup of strong tea warming his hands as he watched the community awaken. He had slept surprisingly well on a bed of buffalo robes, lulled by the gentle crackling of the fire and the sense of safety that permeated the lodge. Now, as he observed the daily rhythm of a people he had known only through distant encounters and second-hand tales, he felt a growing discomfort with his previous ignorance. These were not the savages described in newspaper accounts, or the simple, childlike people depicted in government reports. The Crow community functioned with complex social structures, deep spiritual traditions, and practical knowledge that had allowed them to thrive in this harsh environment for generations. In just one day, James had witnessed technological innovations, educational methods, and medical practices that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, those of the white settlements. Frank emerged from the lodge where he'd been accommodated, nodding a greeting as he joined James. We should start back by midday, the foreman advised. Weather looks clear, but no sense pushing our luck. James nodded, feeling a curious reluctance at the thought of departure. There's something I'd like to discuss with you first, he said, lowering his voice though no one was near enough to overhear. An idea that came to me during the night. Frank raised an eyebrow, but listened attentively as James outlined his thoughts. A proposal that would require legal negotiations, financial commitments, and a fundamental shift in his relationship with the Crow people. When he finished, the foreman was silent for a long moment, studying his employer with new eyes. It's a good idea, he said finally. Better than good, but it won't be easy. There'll be opposition from some quarters. I'm aware, James replied, surprising himself with the steel in his voice, but I believe it's the right thing to do, not just for Sarah and her people, but for all of us trying to make a life in this territory. Frank nodded slowly, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. Then I'm with you, boss. All the way. The remainder of the morning passed in preparations for departure and formal farewells. Matthew Three Eagles, who James now understood was not only Sarah's uncle, but a respected leader within the community, presented both visitors with gifts, intricately beaded leather pouches containing sacred tobacco. For your journey, he explained. Oh, and as a reminder that you will always find welcome among the people of many lodges. James accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, knowing it represented far more than a simple gesture of thanks. It was an acknowledgement of connection, an invitation to continued relationship. As the time for departure drew near, James sought out Sarah, finding her with her grandmother near the medicine lodge. The old woman was showing her granddaughter how to prepare some kind of herbal remedy, their heads bent together over a stone mortar where they ground dried leaves to a fine powder. They looked up at his approach, and Sarah's face brightened with a smile that tugged at something deep in James's chest. She wore her traditional clothing now, her hair freshly braided with colorful threads, looking every inch a daughter of her people. Yet the bond that had formed between them during her stay at Blackwood Ranch remained palpable. You leave soon, she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. James nodded. Frank says the weather is favorable for travel. We should reach the ranch by tomorrow evening. Sarah exchanged a glance with her grandmother, who nodded slightly before rising with the fluid grace that belied her advanced age. Come, Ceasefire Woman said to James. Walk with an old woman. She led him away from the lodge toward the edge of the encampment where the ground sloped gently down to the river. Despite her years, she moved with sure steps, occasionally pausing to point out a particular plant or formation of rocks, naming each in her language. "My granddaughter has a gift," she said, after they had walked in companionable silence for some time. "She sees with more than eyes, feels with more than hands." The old woman fixed him with her penetrating gaze. "She has seen your heart, James Blackwood, the good in it, and also the sorrow." James found himself unable to look away, pinned by the quiet authority in her eyes. "She's helped me see things I've been blind to for a long time," he admitted. C's far woman nodded, satisfied. "This is her medicine. Not just herbs and healing stones, but the ability to wake sleeping spirits." She reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "For you," she said, placing it in his palm. James carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a carved stone pendant on a leather cord, a miniature hawk with outstretched wings, remarkably similar to the wooden one Sarah carried. "My husband carved this many seasons ago," C's far woman explained. "It is a reminder that sometimes we must rise above to see the true path." She gestured for him to put it on, which he did, feeling the weight of the stone against his chest like a small anchor. "Thank you," he said, understanding the significance of such a personal gift. "I will treasure it." The old woman studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once more. "You will return," she stated with calm certainty, "and when you do, you will bring more than just yourself." As they walked back toward the camp, James caught sight of Sarah helping a younger child master the art of finger weaving, her patience and gentleness evident even from a distance. Watching her, secure in the embrace of her community yet forever changed by her time in his world, James felt something settle within him, a purpose, a direction that had been missing for far too long. The path ahead would not be simple. There would be obstacles, resistance, perhaps even conflict. But for the first time in 12 years, James Blackwood looked to the future with something approaching hope. Spring came to Montana Territory in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong, the land awakening from its winter slumber with vibrant energy. At Blackwood Ranch, the transformation of the landscape was mirrored by changes within its owner that had the ranch hands exchanging puzzled but approving glances. James Blackwood, once known for his solitary habits and taciturn demeanor, now rode his property with purpose and engagement, stopping to discuss improvements with his men, listening to their suggestions with genuine interest. The ledgers were not forgotten. He remained a shrewd businessman, but they no longer defined the boundaries of his world. "He's like a different man," Frank Mason remarked to his wife over supper one evening. "Oh, got a fire lit under him I haven't seen since before Mrs. Blackwood passed." That fire had been kindled by a 12-year-old girl found half frozen in the snow, and it burned steadily through the spring months as James set his new plans in motion. The journey back from the Crow encampment had given him time to refine his ideas, and upon his return, he'd immediately summoned his lawyer from Helena. "I want to establish a foundation," he had explained, spreading maps across his desk. "Educational opportunities for native children, particularly those from the Crow Nation, land set aside for their use in perpetuity, protected from future development or seizure." The lawyer had blinked in astonishment. "That's highly unusual, Mr. Blackwood. There will be opposition." James had merely nodded, unperturbed. "I expect so. Nevertheless, we proceed." And proceed he did, with the same determination that had built his cattle empire. By mid-spring, the Blackwood Educational Foundation was established with a substantial endowment and clear mission to provide resources for Native youth to learn both traditional knowledge and the skills needed to navigate an increasingly complex world where their rights and culture were under constant threat. The Foundation's first project was already underway, a school building constructed on the eastern edge of Blackwood property, closest to Crow territory, with teachers hired from both communities. Sarah Littlefeather, though still too young to teach formally, had been consulted on the curriculum, her insights proving invaluable in creating a program that respected Indigenous knowledge while providing practical education. Mrs. Abernathy, initially skeptical of such radical changes, had become one of the most enthusiastic supporters, volunteering to teach cooking and household management at the new school. "These children deserve every advantage," she declared, with the fierce protectiveness that had once been reserved solely for the Blackwood household. But perhaps the most profound change came in the form of a letter James wrote one evening in April, seated at the desk in his study where Sarah's carved hawk now held place of honor beside the portrait of his late wife. "My dear Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well. I know it has been some time since I've written properly, for which I can only offer my sincere apology. Something remarkable has happened here at the ranch. Something that has made me see the years since we lost your mother and Thomas with new clarity. I met a child, a Crow girl named Sarah Littlefeather, under extraordinary circumstances." The letter continued for 7 pages, the longest he had ever written, pouring out the story of Sarah's rescue, her wisdom beyond her years, and the transformation her presence had catalyzed in his heart. He wrote of regrets, how he had failed Catherine in her grief, retreating into his own pain rather than helping her navigate hers. He wrote of hope, for reconciliation, for a chance to know her husband, perhaps even to welcome them both to Montana if they were ever inclined to visit. "Words are medicine too," Sarah had told him. "They can heal distance." He posted the letter with a prayer that she had been right. Summer brought the first students to the new school, 20 children from the Crow encampment and neighboring settlements, including Sarah, who arrived with her grandmother's blessing to study while continuing her training in traditional medicine. 3 days a week, she stayed at Blackwood Ranch, occupying the room that had once been Catherine's, filling it with the scent of dried herbs and the quiet humming of Crow lullabies. On one such evening in late July, as twilight painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose, a carriage arrived unannounced at Blackwood Ranch. James was on the porch, discussing the next day's lessons with Sarah when the sound of wheels on the gravel drive drew their attention. A woman descended from the carriage, tall, slender, with honey-colored hair pinned in an Eastern fashion. Though 12 years had passed since he'd seen her, James would have known his daughter anywhere. "Catherine," he breathed, hardly daring to believe his eyes. She stood uncertainly at the foot of the steps. A letter, his letter, clutched in her gloved hand. "Hello, Father," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Boston society, but with the unmistakable undercurrent of Montana in its depths. For a moment, neither moved, the weight of years and unspoken words hanging between them. Then Sarah, with her uncanny intuition, slipped from the porch and approached Catherine with outstretched hands. "You are James's daughter," she said simply. "He has waited for you." Something in the girl's direct gaze seemed to break the spell. Catherine's composure wavered, her eyes filling with tears as she looked past Sarah to her father. James descended the steps, heart pounding, and opened his arms. After the briefest hesitation, Catherine stepped into his embrace. "I got your letter," she said against his shoulder. "I had to come to see for myself." "I'm so glad you did," he whispered, holding her as if she might vanish like a dream at dawn. By summer's end, Blackwood Ranch had become home to not only Sarah on her school nights, but also to 3 other children, orphans from a neighboring settlement whose plight James could no longer ignore once his heart had reawakened to the world around him. Catherine had returned to Boston, but with promises to visit again, perhaps next time with her husband, and news of the grandchild they hoped for in the coming year. And on clear evenings, when the work of the day was done, James Blackwood could often be found on his porch, surrounded by children's laughter, watching the sunset with a hawk-shaped pendant resting against his chest, no longer the solitary figure whose empire had been built on grief, but a man who had found his way back to the circle of belonging.